Don't let her find me." The plea tore from Annie's throat the moment she rushed out of the side hallway. Richard Bennett had barely turned toward the sound when she ran straight into him. Annie's shoulder struck his chest, and the cleaning cloth slipped from her hand and slid across the stone floor. She stumbled back a step, then suddenly wrapped both arms around him, holding on as though the moment she let go, she would have nowhere left to run. "Please," Annie said between uneven breaths. Her fingers clutched the back of Richard's suit jacket. "Please don't let her find me." Richard stopped cold. He had been on his way to the front entrance, carrying a briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other. His driver was already waiting outside. Daniel, his assistant, had just reminded him for the second time that the Bennett Medical Board meeting would begin at 9 and that several members had already arrived. But at that moment, the schedule vanished from his mind. Annie was pressed against his chest. Richard could feel her trembling through his suit. "Annie?" She slowly looked up. Her hair was disheveled, with several loose strands clinging to her cheeks. Her eyes were red, and the corners were still wet. One hand still wore the yellow rubber glove she used for cleaning, while the other gripped Richard's jacket so tightly that her fingertips had turned white. "Who?" Richard asked. "Who are you talking about?" Annie tried to speak, but just then, a voice called out from somewhere beyond the side garden. "Annie!" Annie's entire body jerked. Richard felt her hand tighten against his back. "Annie, come out here." Annie immediately lowered her face. "That's her," she whispered. Richard looked toward the large windows lining the hallway. The woman's voice drifted in again, but this time, it was different. The anger was gone. Her voice suddenly became so gentle that anyone listening might have wondered whether it was really the same woman who had been shouting only seconds earlier. "Annie, sweetheart, where are you? Come on out. We need to talk." Annie shook her head again and again. "No." Richard looked down at her. "Who is she?" Annie swallowed. "My stepmother." Before Richard could ask another question, Annie released him and immediately slipped behind his back. She did not seem to think before doing it. The moment her eyes landed on the glass windows overlooking the garden, her body simply moved toward the only place that could hide her from anyone outside. Richard was now the only thing standing between Annie and those windows. She stayed close behind his shoulder, wrapping her arms around herself. Richard turned slightly. "Annie, I'm sorry. What are you apologizing for?" Annie looked down. "I shouldn't have grabbed you like that." Richard studied her for a few seconds. "That isn't what I'm asking about." Annie caught the edge of the cleaning glove at her wrist. "She came here to take me away." "Why?" Her eyes immediately went back to the windows. Outside, the woman shouted again. "Annie." This time, there was no sweetness in her voice. Richard handed his briefcase to Daniel. Daniel canceled the car. Daniel stared at him. "Sir, you have the Bennett Medical Board meeting at 9. They can start without me." Daniel asked no further questions. Richard turned back to Annie. "Come inside." She remained where she was. "Mr. Bennett." Farther inside the house. Annie looked at the windows. "If I walk past there, she might see me." Richard stepped to the side, positioning himself so that his body blocked the view from the garden. "Then walk behind me." Annie looked at him. "Stay close until we're past the windows." She gave the smallest nod. Richard started toward his study. Annie followed directly behind him. She walked almost exactly in his footsteps, and twice the toe of her shoe nearly caught his heel, but she was too frightened to slow down. As they passed the dining room, Mrs. Davis came out carrying a stack of freshly folded towels. She stopped the moment she saw Annie. "Oh, sweetheart." Annie bit her lip. Those two words nearly broke whatever strength she had left to hold back her tears. Mrs. Davis quickly set the towels on a nearby table. "What happened?" Richard opened the door to his study. "Mrs. Davis, come in with us." "Of course." Annie entered first. Richard closed the door, then went directly to a wooden cabinet beside his desk. Inside was the control panel connected to the estate's security system. Cameras covered the gates, driveway, rear grounds, gardens, and service entrances. Richard rarely opened the system himself. This morning, he touched the screen without hesitation. "Which way did she come in?" Annie stood several feet from the monitor, unwilling to move any closer. "The side gate." Richard selected the corresponding camera. At first, the screen showed only the stone path behind the east garden and rows of neatly trimmed shrubs. Then a woman entered the frame. She wore a cream-colored coat, carried a large handbag, and moved quickly between the hedges. Her high heels sank into the damp grass, but she did not seem to care. Every few steps she stopped to look toward the house, then turned in another direction and continued searching. She disappeared from the first camera. Richard switched to the one near the rose garden. The woman appeared again. He frowned. She came this far onto my property by herself? Annie nodded. On the screen, Margaret cupped her hands around her mouth. Annie, stop being ridiculous. Annie immediately stepped backward. Her heel bumped against the leg of a chair behind her. Mrs. Davis reached out and gently steadied her arm. Only a few seconds later, Margaret suddenly stopped on the screen. She straightened the collar of her coat, smoothed her hair, and completely changed her expression. Annie, sweetheart, come out. I'm not angry. We can go have breakfast and talk everything through. A tiny laugh escaped Annie. There was no happiness in it. Mrs. Davis looked at her. What is it? Annie lowered her head. She always does that. Does what? Whenever someone else can hear her, she starts talking really sweet. Richard turned away from the monitor. Annie realized they were both looking at her and immediately drew her shoulders inward. Then she'll tell everyone I'm ungrateful, Annie said. She'll say she only wants what's best for me and that I don't appreciate anything she's done. She tugged lightly at the cleaning glove around her wrist. But when no one else is there, she doesn't talk to me like that. Richard watched her a little longer. Do you want to go with her? No, Annie answered immediately. Without hesitation, Richard continued. Do you want her inside this house? No. Good. He picked up the house phone. Security. A voice answered at once. Yes, Mr. Bennett. There's a woman in a cream-colored coat in the East Garden. We have her on camera. Remove her from the property. Annie looked up. Richard continued. Do not let her near Annie. Do not let her inside the house. Take her directly to the gate. Understood, sir. Richard put the phone down. Outside, Margaret had reached the terrace. Annie. Her voice was now loud enough to carry through the closed windows. Come out here right now. Annie immediately shifted closer to Richard. She did not grab him again. She simply moved one step nearer. But Richard noticed. You can stay right here, he said. Margaret continued shouting. Annie Carter, do you hear me? Two security officers appeared on the monitor. One approached Margaret directly. The other positioned himself between her and the path leading to the house. Margaret immediately pointed toward the windows. My daughter is in there. One of the guards answered, but the microphone was too far away for them to make out his words. Margaret threw both hands into the air. I have every right to see her. The guard pointed toward the gate. Margaret refused to move. Then she lifted her head and shouted again. Annie, sweetheart, come on, stop embarrassing yourself like this. Annie's eyes immediately turned red. I knew she would come. Richard turned toward her. You knew? Annie looked down at her hands. She called me this morning. Did you answer? Annie shook her head. Why not? She pressed her palms together. The rubber glove made a faint squeak under the pressure. She said someone was waiting for me. Richard looked at her. Who? Annie did not answer. On the monitor, Margaret was still arguing, while the two security officers began escorting her toward the side gate. Richard did not push Annie. After a moment he said, Annie, listen to me. She looked up. No matter who is waiting for you, you do not have to go anywhere with them if you don't want to. Annie stared at him without blinking. The words seemed to confuse her more than any of his questions had, as though she understood every word but had never considered that the same rule might apply to her. I don't have to go? She asked quietly. No. Richard pulled a chair away from his desk. Sit down. Annie looked toward the door. I should get back to work. Richard thought he had misheard her. Now? I still have some rooms upstairs to clean. Annie, if I don't finish them, Mrs. Davis will have to move someone else over. Everyone already has their own work today. Mrs. Davis looked at her, sadness passing briefly through her eyes. Richard turned to her. Mrs. Davis. Yes? Does Annie have anything she absolutely has to do in the next hour? Mrs. Davis folded her arms across her chest. Not anymore. Annie looked up. But, no buts, Mrs. Davis said. Those beds can wait. The corner of Annie's mouth lifted slightly. Just a little. The smile was so small that anyone not looking directly at her might have missed it. Then a sudden pounding sounded from somewhere near the front entrance. Annie jumped. The smile disappeared immediately. Annie, I know you're in there. Richard turned sharply toward the security screen. Somehow, Margaret had slipped around the two guards and made it back toward the front driveway before they could block her route. Richard picked up the phone again. His voice was shorter this time. Security. Enough. Sir, take her to the gate now. Once she's outside, lock it behind her. Yes, sir. Richard set the phone down and turned back. She is not coming inside. Annie swallowed. You don't know her. No, I don't. She won't stop. Richard pulled out the chair across from Annie and sat down. Then we're going to find out why. Annie lowered her head. The hand still wearing the cleaning glove rested on her knee, while the other kept picking nervously at the edge of her apron. Richard asked nothing else. He waited. A long moment passed before Annie finally spoke. She owes someone money. Mrs. Davis pulled the chair beside Annie closer and sat down. Richard asked, How much? I don't know. What kind of debt? Annie pressed her lips together. Gambling. Richard looked at her. And what does her gambling debt have to do with you? Annie fell silent. Her fingers stopped picking at the apron. Her shoulders slowly drew inward. She closed her eyes for several seconds before opening them again. There was shame on Annie's face that made Mrs. Davis turn away for a moment. But Annie had nothing to be ashamed of. She spoke so quietly that Richard almost missed it. She told that man that I would marry him. Richard did not react immediately. Annie tried to take a breath, but it came in short. She continued before the courage she had managed to gather disappeared. She said if I agreed to marry him, he would forgive everything she owed. Richard looked at her. Did you agree? Annie immediately shook her head. No. Her voice caught. I've told her no so many times. Her hands began to tremble again. But she keeps telling me not to be selfish. She says she raised me and gave me a place to live, so now it's my turn to help her. Mrs. Davis rested one hand lightly on the back of Annie's chair without touching her. Annie looked down at the yellow cleaning glove still covering one of her hands. This morning she told me to ask to leave work early. When I asked why, she said the man was sitting outside in the car waiting. Richard asked, She was going to take you to meet him? Annie nodded. I told her I wasn't going. Her throat tightened. She told me not to embarrass her. Then she said if I didn't come outside on my own, she would come in here and find me. Annie quickly wiped the corner of her eye. I thought she was only trying to scare me. Outside, Margaret's voice carried toward them again. Annie. Annie flinched, but this time she did not stand. Richard looked at her. Who is the man? Annie was quiet for a while before answering. Charles Whitmore. Richard's expression changed only slightly. He knew the name. Charles Whitmore is waiting outside in the car? Annie nodded. She said he doesn't like to be kept waiting. Richard glanced at the security monitor, then back at her. How old is he? Annie clasped her hands together. I don't know exactly. Over 50. Mrs. Davis went still. Richard looked at Annie for another moment. The young woman sitting in front of him was still wearing her housekeeping uniform, with one rubber glove she had not even had time to remove. After running from a stepmother who was trying to take her away, one of the first things Annie had worried about once she was safe was the unfinished rooms upstairs. And you? Richard asked. Annie looked at him. 18. Richard slowly set the phone down on the desk. Outside, Margaret was still shouting Annie's name, but Richard no longer cared about the noise. He looked at the young woman sitting in front of him, still wearing one cleaning glove, still worried about the work she had left unfinished, while someone else was trying to trade away her future to settle a debt of their own. Annie, he said, tell me everything from the beginning. Annie sat on the very edge of the chair, her knees pressed together and both hands resting neatly in her lap, as though she were still waiting for someone to give her another task. One of her hands was still covered by the yellow rubber glove she used for cleaning. She did not notice until her thumb began unconsciously rubbing against the rubber. Then she quickly pulled the glove off, smoothed it flat, folded it in half, then folded it again. Even when it had become a small square resting between her palms, she kept adjusting the edges until they lined up. Richard noticed everything but did not stop her. He sat in the chair across from her instead of taking the one beside her. There was enough space between them that Annie did not feel cornered. Mrs. Davis stood near Annie's right side. Not too close, but close enough that Annie could reach for her without having to ask. It took a while before Annie finally spoke. My stepmother owes money to a man named Charles Whitmore. Richard leaned forward slightly. How much? Annie shook her head. I don't know. She's never told me the real amount. Then tell me what you do know. Annie did not answer immediately. She turned toward the security monitor mounted on the wall. Outside, 2 security guards were escorting Margaret along the driveway toward the main gate. Every few steps, Margaret turned back toward the mansion, still talking nonstop to the guard beside her. Annie tightened her fingers around the folded glove. She said Mr. Charles could make the whole debt disappear. Richard asked, How? Annie lowered her eyes. If I married him, Mrs. Davis, standing beside her, went still. Did you agree to that? Annie's head came up quickly. No. The answer came almost instantly. Mrs. Davis pulled the nearby chair out a little but remained standing. Have you ever told that man you wanted to marry him? No. Have you signed anything? No. Have you taken any money from him? Annie shook her head again. Not a single dollar. Richard watched her fingers. The glove was already folded perfectly, yet Annie continued running her thumb along its rubber edge. Then why does Margaret believe she gets to make that decision for you? Annie's hands stopped moving. Her answer was barely above a whisper. Because she thinks I have to do what she says. You're 18. I know. Then you don't have to marry anyone just because she tells you to. Annie looked up. Her expression was not that of someone hearing something obvious. If anything, she looked confused, as though Richard had just said something no one had ever allowed her to consider before. But she raised me. Richard rested one hand on the arm of his chair. That doesn't give her the right to decide who you marry. Annie lowered her eyes again. She says I owe her. For what? Annie was quiet for a moment, then began counting on her fingers. Food. One finger. Clothes. A second. A place to live. A third. Gas whenever she drove me somewhere. She opened another finger. My phone bill. Things for the house. Sometimes groceries. Mrs. Davis did not let her continue. Annie. She stopped. Those are things adults are supposed to provide when they're raising a child. They are not bills someone gets to save for years and then make you repay later. Annie gave a faint shake of her head, but she wrote everything down. Richard frowned. What do you mean? She has a notebook. What's in it? Every expense. Annie lowered her head farther. She says it shows how much she spent on me since I came to live with her. She even writes down the dates. Richard said nothing for several seconds. She makes you pay those amounts back? Annie pinched the edge of the glove between her fingers. I give her my paycheck. How much of it? She went silent. Annie? Almost all of it. Mrs. Davis turned toward her. What does almost all mean? Some months I keep $100. And the rest? I transfer it to her. Richard briefly tightened the watch strap around his wrist, then let it go. Your paycheck goes into an account in your name? Yes, sir. Does Margaret have access to that account? No. Then why do you transfer the money? Annie did not answer. Richard changed the question. What happens if you keep it? This time she answered immediately. She'll know. And then what happens? She gets angry. Just angry? Annie began twisting the glove she had worked so carefully to fold. Mrs. Davis bent slightly and gently placed her hand over Annie's. Annie stopped twisting it. Richard asked, Has she ever threatened to throw you out of the house? Annie nodded. Taken your phone? Another nod. Kept your money? Annie nodded again. Your documents? This time Annie's head snapped up. Richard stopped. Margaret has your documents? Annie slowly nodded. My birth certificate. What else? My social security card. Some school papers. Old bank records. Do you have any important identification with you? I have my driver's license. And everything else? At home. Why does she keep it? Annie answered as if repeating a sentence she had heard many times before. She says I lose things. She says important papers are safer with her. Mrs. Davis looked at Richard. Annie noticed. She immediately began defending Margaret. But she keeps her own papers there too. Maybe that part is just... Annie. Richard cut her off. She fell silent. You don't have to find an excuse for Margaret every time you tell us something she's done. Annie's lips parted slightly, then closed again. It seemed she had not even realized how often she did it. At that moment, a voice carried in from outside. Annie. Her shoulders jerked. Margaret's voice came again from the direction of the gate. Annie. Come out here, honey. I just want to talk. We can work this out. The glove slipped from Annie's hand and fell onto the carpet. She bent to pick it up, but Mrs. Davis got there first. I'll get it. She placed the glove on the table. Annie turned toward the door. She's going to get angrier. Security is out there, Mrs. Davis said. She doesn't like people stopping her. That's security's job. Annie shook her head. You don't understand. Richard looked at the monitor. Margaret was standing just outside the gate. One hand braced against the security vehicle, while the other kept pointing toward the mansion. He asked, What does Margaret usually do when someone embarrasses her? Annie did not answer. Her teeth pressed lightly against the inside of her lower lip. Annie? She lowered her head. She waits until no one else is around. Richard turned back to her. And then? Then she finds something I did wrong. Even when you didn't do anything. Annie took a moment before answering. She always finds something. Mrs. Davis slowly lowered the hand resting on the back of Annie's chair and touched her shoulder, barely applying any pressure. Richard gave Annie a few seconds before speaking again. Annie, look at me. She raised her eyes. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Annie swallowed. You don't need to explain anything. Don't think about what Margaret would say. And don't answer the way you think I want you to. He leaned toward her slightly. Just tell me what you want. Annie nodded. Do you want to leave here with Margaret today? She looked down at her hands. No. Do you want to get into Charles Whitmore's car? No. Richard asked the final question. Do you want to marry him? This time Annie did not lower her head. No. Her voice was still soft, but clear. Richard nodded. All right. Annie waited. When he said nothing more, she looked almost confused. That's all? Richard leaned back in his chair. What else do you think there needs to be? She says I don't understand. Understand what? How much she owes. Annie looked toward the monitor. She says if I don't help her, they won't leave her alone. That doesn't change the fact that you just said no. But what if they do something to her? Annie's voice began to tremble. If I just agreed to meet Mr. Charles once, or talk to him, maybe. Mrs. Davis gently interrupted. Listen to what you're saying, Annie. Annie turned toward her. Margaret borrowed the money. Annie said nothing. Margaret created the debt. Mrs. Davis pulled the chair closer and sat down so they were at eye level. But you're the one sitting here afraid that something might happen to Margaret. Annie's eyes began to redden. I don't want anything to happen to anyone. Mrs. Davis gently squeezed her hand. You're part of anyone. Annie turned her face away. She quickly wiped beneath one eye with the heel of her palm, but a second tear slipped down before she could catch it. If Annie's story touched your heart and you believe she deserves the right to choose her own future, please like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from because someone near you may be watching too. And subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Richard stood and walked toward the window. Outside the gate, the security team had finally managed to get Margaret off the property, but across the road, a black Mercedes remained parked exactly where it had been. Richard watched it for several seconds. Charles hasn't left. Annie immediately turned toward the monitor. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. Richard asked, Have you ever spoken to him directly? Once. When? Yesterday. Where? Not in person. Margaret called him and put him on speaker. Richard turned back. What did Charles say? Annie pulled her feet closer together. He said if I married him, I wouldn't have to worry about money anymore. What else? He said I'd have a nice house. She hesitated. Akkad. What else? He said I wouldn't have to clean other people's houses anymore. Mrs. Davis's mouth curved slightly. How thoughtful of him. Annie almost laughed. Just barely. Then the expression disappeared. He asked what kind of clothes I liked, where I wanted to go, whether I'd ever been outside the country. Richard asked, What did you tell him? I said I didn't need any of those things. What did he say? He just kept talking. As if you hadn't said anything? Annie nodded. Like Margaret and he had already decided everything. I was just the last person they bothered to tell. Richard placed both hands on the edge of the desk. Did you tell him directly that you didn't want to marry him? I was going to. Going to? I got as far as saying, I don't want to. And Margaret grabbed the phone. Richard paused. Did Charles threaten you? Annie thought about it. Not directly. Tell me exactly what you remember. She drew in a breath. He said Margaret had made promises she couldn't keep. Richard did not interrupt. Then he said, When money problems go too far, sometimes a family has to know how to make sacrifices. Mrs. Davis withdrew her hand from Annie's and closed it over her own knee. Richard asked, He used the word sacrifices? Annie nodded. Then he said I was 18 now, so I should be smart enough not to make things harder. For whom? Annie shook her head. He didn't say. Richard understood. Do you still have your phone? Yes. Annie took it from the pocket of her uniform. The plastic case was cracked at one corner. She placed it on the desk but kept 2 fingers resting against its edge. Richard did not touch it. Don't delete anything. Annie looked up. What? Messages, calls, voicemails, anything Margaret or Charles sent you. Why? Because this is no longer something the 3 of us should try to handle by ourselves. Annie froze. A few seconds later, she pulled the phone closer to herself. Don't call the police. Mrs. Davis turned toward her. Richard stayed where he was. Why? Annie shook her head. Please, Annie, I need to know why. If they arrest her, her throat tightened. She'll say it was because of me. Margaret came here on her own. But she tried to take you with her after you told her you didn't want to go. Annie clutched the phone in both hands. Other people won't know that. What people? The neighbors. Her friends. People who know me. She lowered her head. They'll say I called the police on my own mother. She's your stepmother. But she still raised me, Richard answered. And that still doesn't take away your right to ask for help. Annie suddenly stood. The chair scraped softly across the carpet. I don't need anyone to call anybody. Mrs. Davis stood as well. Annie, I can work. She bent to pick up the glove from the table, but in her hurry, it slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor again. Annie picked it up a second time. I can go back to work. I can stay here until she finally leaves. Then after my shift, I'll figure something out. Mrs. Davis asked, Where are you going tonight? Annie stopped. I'll find somewhere. Where? I don't know. Richard asked, Are you planning to go back to Margaret's house? Annie did not answer. She simply looked down and tugged the wrinkled hem of her uniform straight. Richard did not need to ask again. The desk phone suddenly rang. Daniel, who had been standing just outside the study coordinating with security, stepped in and picked it up. Yes. He listened for a moment, then looked toward Richard. All right. Hold your position. Daniel covered the receiver. Mr. Bennett, security says Margaret is refusing to leave the road outside the gate. Annie turned sharply. She's still out there? Daniel nodded. She's demanding that Annie come outside and talk to her. Annie wrapped one hand around the opposite wrist. I could go out and say a few things. Maybe then she'll... No, Mrs. Davis said immediately. Annie turned toward her. If I don't go out there, she'll only get angrier. Daniel was still listening to the voice on the other end. Suddenly his expression changed. Wait. Richard stepped closer. What is it? Daniel listened for a few more seconds, then slowly lowered the receiver from his ear. There's something else. He pointed toward the security monitor. The man in the Mercedes just got out. Annie turned toward the screen. A man in a dark coat had just closed the door of the black Mercedes and was walking toward the gate. The glove slipped from Annie's hand for the third time. This time, she did not bend down to pick it up. The color drained from her face. Charles. Richard moved closer to the monitor. Charles did not stay by the car. He was walking straight toward Margaret. Annie took a step backward. He shouldn't be here. Richard turned toward her. You're sure that's him? Annie nodded quickly. I've seen his picture. Richard watched the screen for several more seconds, then reached for the phone. Annie understood immediately. She stepped toward him. Mr. Bennett. Richard stopped. Annie swallowed hard. Her eyes were already red, but she was fighting not to cry. Please don't make this any bigger than it already is. I'm not making it bigger, Annie. He glanced at Charles on the monitor. They already did that. Richard picked up the phone and instructed security to call the police. Richard kept the phone to his ear while Annie watched him from the other side of the study. Yes, he said. 2 people are outside the gate. One of them entered the property without permission earlier. The employee they came for has stated that she does not want to leave with them. He listened, gave the address, then ended the call. Annie looked down at the glove still folded in her hand. They're really coming? Yes. What am I supposed to say? The truth. That sounds easy when you say it. It usually isn't. Mrs. Davis rose from her chair and went to the small cabinet near the wall. She poured Annie another glass of water. You don't have to give a speech, she said. Answer what they ask, one question at a time. Annie accepted the glass with both hands. On the security monitor, Margaret stood near the gate while Charles remained several feet away. He wore a dark suit and held his phone in one hand. Unlike Margaret, he was not arguing with security. He seemed content to wait. That bothered Richard more. Margaret was angry. Charles was thinking. Daniel stepped closer to the screen. You know him? Only professionally, Richard said. He approached Bennett Medical a few years ago about an investment partnership. I passed. Why? The structure made no sense. Annie looked up. What does that mean? It means there were too many companies between the money and the people responsible for it. Is that bad? Not always. But you didn't trust him. Richard looked at Charles on the monitor. No. Annie held the water without drinking. A few minutes later, the front gate camera showed 2 patrol cars turning onto the road. Margaret saw them. Her entire posture changed. She smoothed the front of her coat, adjusted her handbag, then moved closer to Charles. Annie noticed too. She does that. Richard looked at her. What? She fixes herself before she talks to people, Mrs. Davis said. Nothing unusual about wanting to look presentable. That's not what I mean. Annie watched Margaret through the monitor. When she's yelling, she sounds one way. When somebody important shows up, she sounds like a different person. Richard said nothing. The first officer got out of the patrol car and spoke with the security supervisor. The second walked toward Margaret and Charles. A few minutes later, the house phone rang. Daniel answered. They want to speak with Annie privately. Annie's fingers tightened around the glass. Richard asked, Do you want Mrs. Davis with you? Can she? We can ask. Annie nodded. The officers were brought into a sitting room near the front of the house. Richard stayed outside. It was important that Annie answer without feeling that she had to please him. Mrs. Davis remained in the room only after the officer confirmed Annie was comfortable with her presence. The older of the two officers sat across from Annie. I'm Officer Reynolds. This is Officer Vega. We're going to ask you a few questions. If you don't understand anything, tell us and we'll explain it. Annie nodded. Reynolds asked, Is Margaret Carter your stepmother? Yes. Did she come here today because she wanted you to leave with her? Yes. Did you agree to go? No. Did she threaten you? Annie hesitated. Not exactly today. Reynolds did not rush her. What did she say? She told me Charles was waiting. She said I had to go with them. Who is Charles? Charles Whitmore. Do you know him personally? No. Why does your stepmother want you to go with him? Annie's face tightened. She owes him money. Reynolds glanced briefly at Vega, then returned his attention to Annie. What does that have to do with you? She told him I would marry him. Officer Vega asked, Did you agree to that? No. Did you ever sign anything? No. Did Mr. Whitmore ask you directly? He called yesterday. What did he say? Annie repeated the conversation as carefully as she could. He said I'd have a better life. He said Margaret had made promises and that families sometimes have to make difficult arrangements when money is involved. Reynolds asked, Did he mention the debt? Yes. Did he say the debt would be cleared if you married him? Not exactly like that. What did he say exactly? Annie closed her eyes for a moment, searching for the words. He said, Once this is settled, Margaret won't have to worry about what she owes me anymore. Officer Reynolds wrote it down. Annie looked at the notepad. Is she going to be arrested? We haven't made that decision. She'll blame me. That isn't what we're deciding. Annie looked toward Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis said gently, Stay with the question in front of you. Reynolds continued, Do you feel safe going home with Margaret today? No. Do you want to go anywhere with Mr. Whitmore? No. Do you want either of them to contact you right now? Annie shook her head. No. The answer was firmer than the ones before it. Officer Vega asked, Do you have somewhere safe to stay today? Annie paused. Mrs. Davis did not answer for her. I can stay here if Mr. Bennett allows it. Reynolds nodded. Good. We'll talk to them separately. When the officers left the room, Annie remained in the chair for several seconds. Mrs. Davis handed her a tissue. You did fine. I feel sick. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Outside, Margaret was already talking to Officer Reynolds. The security camera had no sound from that angle, but Richard could see her gestures. One hand pressed to her chest, a small shake of the head, then a look toward the house. Charles stood slightly behind her. Richard watched as Margaret suddenly began crying. Daniel said, That was fast. Richard gave him a look. Daniel lowered his voice. Sorry. A few minutes later, Officer Reynolds came into the hall. Mr. Bennett. Richard stepped forward. We need to confirm something with you. Miss Carter says Annie is confused and that this is a family disagreement. Mr. Whitmore says there is no marriage arrangement and that he was only here to help Margaret with transportation. Richard glanced toward Annie, who had stopped near the study door. Reynolds continued, Do you have any documentation connecting Margaret Carter to your household? Richard thought for a moment. Then he remembered the name. Not from this morning. From years ago. Possibly. Annie looked at him. Richard turned to Daniel. Go to the estate records. What am I looking for? Eleanor's private assistance files. Daniel understood immediately. Richard added, Search Margaret Carter. Annie's expression changed. My stepmother knew your wife? I don't know yet. 10 minutes later, Daniel returned carrying a thin paper file. He placed it on Richard's desk. Richard opened it. The first page was a copy of a personal loan agreement signed by Eleanor Bennett. The borrower was Margaret Carter. The stated purpose of the money appeared 2 lines below. Educational expenses and personal support for Annie Carter. Richard read it twice. Then he looked across the desk at Annie. Did Margaret ever tell you my wife gave her money for you? Annie's face went blank. No. Richard turned the page. The amount was large enough to make Annie grip the edge of her chair. She whispered, I never got that. Richard looked at Officer Reynolds. What started as a family dispute may be something else. Outside, Margaret was still insisting she had done nothing wrong. Inside, Annie had just learned that someone had once handed her stepmother enough money to change her future. And somehow, none of it had reached her. Annie kept looking at the number on the loan agreement as if another glance might make one of the digits disappear. It did not. That was for me? She asked. Richard turned the document so she could see the wording clearly. That is what Margaret told Eleanor. Annie read the line again. Educational expenses and personal support for Annie Carter. I never saw any of it. Officer Reynolds pulled his notebook from his pocket. Do you have your own bank account? Yes. Did Margaret ever deposit a large amount into it? No. Pay tuition somewhere? I'm not in college. Richard looked at her. Annie noticed. I wanted to go, she said quickly. I just couldn't afford it. Mrs. Davis shifted closer. Officer Reynolds asked, Did Margaret ever tell you there was money available for school? No. Did she ever mention Mrs. Bennet? No. Richard closed the file halfway, then stopped. The signature at the bottom was Eleanor's. He recognized every curve of it. There was no need to turn the moment into a memory. The document was enough. Officer Vega asked, Do you know whether this loan was ever repaid? Richard looked at Daniel. Daniel checked the final page. No repayment is recorded here. Reynolds nodded. We'll need copies. You'll have them. Annie raised her head. Does this mean she stole it? Reynolds answered carefully. It means we have questions about what Margaret represented when she obtained the money and where it went. We don't decide the conclusion before we check the records. Annie looked disappointed, almost as if she wanted one simple word that would explain everything. Richard understood. People liked simple answers because simple answers hurt less. She used my name, Annie said. Yes, Reynolds replied. And your wife thought she was helping me. Richard did not soften the truth. Yes. Annie looked toward the window. I feel stupid. Mrs. Davis reacted immediately. No, I was living with her. I should have known. You should have known someone was using paperwork you had never seen? Annie did not answer. Mrs. Davis continued. That makes no sense, sweetheart. A knock came at the study door. One of the security officers stepped inside. Mr. Bennet. Margaret Carter is demanding to speak with Annie before she leaves. Richard looked at Annie. No, she said before anyone could ask. The security officer nodded. Understood. Then Margaret's voice carried faintly from outside. Annie, I know you can hear me. Annie's shoulders rose. Richard turned toward the security officer. Keep her at the gate. We are. Margaret shouted again. Come out here. You are making a fool of yourself. Annie looked at the floor. Officer Reynolds closed his notebook. I'm going back outside. Annie looked up. What are you going to say to her? I'm going to ask about the loan. Then I'm going to ask about Mr. Whitmore. Her face tightened. Can she make me go with her? No. What if she says I live with her? You are an adult. The question is what you want. Annie nodded slowly. Richard said, Stay here. She glanced at him. I want to see. See what? What she says. Officer Reynolds considered it. You can watch from the security feed if Mr. Bennet allows it. Richard switched the monitor to the front gate camera. Outside, Reynolds approached Margaret while Vega walked toward Charles. Margaret immediately started talking with both hands. The camera had audio near the gate. Her voice came through the speakers. This has been blown completely out of proportion. Annie gets emotional. She misunderstood a conversation. Reynolds said, We have a loan agreement showing you received money from Eleanor Bennet for Annie's educational and personal expenses. Margaret stopped moving. Inside the study, Annie's fingers closed around the edge of the desk. Reynolds continued, Did you receive that money? Margaret recovered quickly. Yes, years ago. Where did it go? Expenses. What expenses? Living expenses, food, housing, things Annie needed. Annie whispered, That's not what it says. Richard heard her but kept his attention on the monitor. Reynolds asked, Do you have records showing how the funds were used? Margaret's voice sharpened. I don't carry old receipts around with me. You may be asked to provide financial records. For a private loan? For several reasons. Margaret glanced toward Charles. That small movement did not escape Reynolds. Neither did it escape Richard. At the other side of the gate, Officer Vega was speaking with Charles. Charles maintained the same polished expression he had worn since arriving. Vega asked, "Did you come here expecting Annie Carter to leave with you?" Charles gave a slight shrug. "I offered Margaret a ride. Was Annie supposed to join you?" "I was told she might." "Did you discuss marriage with her yesterday?" Charles smiled faintly. "Marriage? That sounds dramatic." Inside, Annie's face changed. "He's lying." Richard did not look away from the screen. Vega continued, "Did you speak to Annie Carter by phone?" "I speak to many people." "That isn't an answer." Charles slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. "I may have spoken to her briefly." "Did you tell her Margaret's debt would be resolved after an arrangement involving Annie?" Charles's expression tightened for the first time. "I have no idea how she interpreted a private conversation." Annie stood. "He said it." Mrs. Davis touched her arm. "I know. No, he's making it sound like I imagined it." Officer Vega asked, "Do you have any financial relationship with Margaret Carter?" Charles answered, "She is invested through businesses associated with me." "Does she owe you money?" Charles paused. "That depends on how you define debt." Richard's eyes narrowed. Daniel said quietly, "That's an interesting answer." On the other side of the feed, Reynolds returned to Margaret. "Miss Carter, Annie has stated clearly that she does not want to leave with you or Mr. Whitmore." Margaret's voice rose. "She doesn't understand what she is throwing away." Reynolds said, "That decision is hers. You people don't know her. She has given us her answer." Margaret pointed toward the house. "I paid for her life. I fed her, housed her, clothed her, and now she thinks she can walk away because some billionaire decided to interfere?" Inside the study, Annie looked as though the words had hit her physically. Then Margaret said the one thing she could not take back. "She owes me." Officer Reynolds replied, "A person is not repayment for a financial debt." Margaret took a step toward the gate. "I want my daughter out here." A security officer blocked the entrance. Margaret tried to move around him. Reynolds told her to stop. She did not. Her voice climbed higher as she called Annie's name again and reached toward the gate. The officers intervened. Within seconds, Margaret was being escorted toward the patrol car while protesting that everyone had misunderstood her. Annie watched from the monitor without moving. When Margaret disappeared from the camera, Annie finally sat down. She looked at Richard. "Is this because of me?" "No. But they're taking her away. Because of what she chose to do." Annie pressed her lips together. Mrs. Davis handed her a tissue. "You can feel sorry for her and still tell the truth." Annie wiped her eyes. Outside, Charles remained near his Mercedes while Officer Vega continued speaking with him. He had not been taken anywhere. "Not yet." Richard looked at Annie's phone on the desk. "Do you still have the call from yesterday?" She nodded. "And messages?" "A few. Don't erase anything." Annie looked toward the security screen once more. "What happens now?" Officer Reynolds returned to the study doorway. "Now we start checking the money." And for the first time, what Margaret had called a family matter was moving into something she could no longer control. Officer Reynolds's words stayed with Annie long after the patrol car carrying Margaret had disappeared from the security screen. "Now we start checking the money." The sentence sounded simple. It was not. By early afternoon, Annie was sitting at a small kitchen table in the staff residence behind the main house, wearing the same gray uniform she had started the morning in. Mrs. Davis had brought her scrambled eggs, toast, and a mug of tea, but most of it remained untouched. "You need to eat something," Mrs. Davis said. "I'm not hungry." That has never stopped food from being useful. Annie picked up half a piece of toast. Mrs. Davis nodded as if that counted as progress. Richard had arranged for Annie to stay temporarily in one of the rooms used by overnight staff. It was not part of the mansion. The room had a narrow bed, a dresser, a desk by the window, and a bathroom she shared with another unused room down the hall. When Richard showed it to her, Annie had looked embarrassed. "I can't afford this. It's employee housing. I don't usually stay here. You usually have somewhere else to go." Annie had no answer to that. Richard had added, "This is temporary. Nobody is charging you for tonight." That mattered to her more than he probably understood. Annie had spent so long hearing the cost of everything that even kindness made her search for the bill attached to it. Now she sat across from Mrs. Davis and stared at her phone. 3 missed calls from relatives. 2 messages from numbers she did not recognize. 1 voicemail from Margaret, recorded before the officers took her away. Annie had not listened to it. Mrs. Davis noticed. You planning to? I don't know. You don't have to decide this minute. Annie turned the phone face down. Everybody's going to hear her version first. Probably. Annie looked up. Mrs. Davis spread a little butter over a biscuit. You wanted me to lie? No. Good. People who tell the truth usually waste less energy keeping track of it. A knock came from the open doorway. Richard stood there with Daniel beside him. Officer Reynolds is back, Richard said. He brought a financial investigator. They would like to speak with you again. Annie put the toast down. Did I do something wrong? No. The question came so quickly that Richard noticed it. Annie being asked questions does not mean you're in trouble. She nodded, though she did not seem convinced. The meeting took place in a smaller sitting room near Richard's office. A woman named Karen Mills introduced herself as a financial crimes investigator working with the county. She had a laptop, a folder, and a pair of reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. I'm going to show you some transactions, Karen said. If you don't recognize something, just say so. All right. Karen opened the first document. This is the transfer from Eleanor Bennett to Margaret Carter. Annie recognized the amount immediately. The number still made her uncomfortable. Karen pointed to several lines below it. Within 4 days, part of that money moved into another account. Then portions of it were spent here. She turned the page. Casino cash advances, hotel charges, online gaming services, large ATM withdrawals. Annie's eyes moved slowly down the list. That's all from the money Mrs. Bennett gave her? Some of it appears to be. Annie looked at Richard. He was standing near the window with his arms at his sides. Did your wife know? No. Karen continued. We also found several transfers from Margaret's account to a business called Whitmore Gaming Holdings. Annie's attention returned to the page. Charles? It appears connected to him. How much? Karen gave her the number. Annie sat back. That can't be right. Why? She always says she doesn't have money. Karen did not comment. Instead, she opened another set of records. These payments are more recent. Some happened within the last 6 months. Annie recognized Margaret's account number. Then she noticed something else. My paycheck goes there sometimes. Karen looked up. Explain that. When I get paid, I transfer money to her. How often? Every pay period. How much? It changes. Do you have access to her account? No. Does she have access to yours? Annie hesitated. She knows my login. Richard's attention sharpened. Karen asked, did you give it to her? She said she needed it in case something happened. What kind of thing? I don't know. Karen typed something into her notes. Change your password today. Annie looked toward Richard. He said, we can have someone from payroll help you set up new direct deposit information if you want. I don't want her to think I'm stealing from her. Karen removed her glasses. Annie, your wages are yours. She'll say I owe her rent. Then rent is discussed as rent. It isn't collected by taking control of your bank account. Annie looked down. Karen softened her tone. I'm not telling you how to feel about Margaret. I'm telling you what the records show. She turned the laptop toward Annie. A chart displayed transfers moving from Margaret's account to several companies. Some had ordinary names. Peachtree Leisure Services, South Coast Consulting, Whitmore Gaming Holdings. One payment had been made 3 days earlier. Annie pointed to it. What's that? Karen clicked. The amount appeared. $25,000. Annie stared at the number. She doesn't have $25,000. She may not. What does that mean? It may have been borrowed. It may have come through another account. We need to trace it. Annie rubbed her hands together. Is that what she owes Charles? We don't know yet. Richard asked. Is there anything tying these payments to legitimate investment activity? Karen looked at him. Not from what I've seen so far. Daniel, who had remained near the door, said, Whitmore's people told Officer Vega Margaret was an investor. Karen gave a short nod. That is one possibility. And the other? That she was paying gambling losses through businesses that do not advertise themselves as gambling businesses. Annie looked from one adult to another. So she was losing money to him? Karen answered carefully. It looks like money was moving from Margaret to companies associated with him. We still have to prove why. Annie's voice dropped. And when she ran out, she offered me. Nobody corrected the sentence. Nobody needed to. Karen closed the folder. One more thing. We want to review your phone records, but only with your permission for the material you have. Messages, calls, voicemail. Anything from Margaret or Charles. Annie touched the phone in her pocket. If I give it to you, do I get it back? Yes. We can make copies of relevant material. Annie thought for a moment, then placed the phone on the table. There's a voicemail from her. Have you listened to it? No. Karen looked at her. Would you like to hear it now, or would you rather we review it first? Annie's fingers moved away from the phone. You listen first. Karen nodded. Richard said nothing, but Annie noticed he did not reach for the phone either. That made the decision feel like hers. An hour later, payroll helped Annie change her deposit information and online banking password. When the employee entered the final confirmation, Annie looked at the screen. For the first time, Margaret did not know how to reach the next paycheck. Annie expected relief. Instead, she felt guilty. Mrs. Davis found her standing outside the payroll office. What is it? I changed the account. Good. It doesn't feel good. Mrs. Davis took Annie's hand. Sometimes freedom feels strange before it feels safe. Before Annie could answer, Daniel appeared at the end of the hall carrying a printed bank statement. Richard wants to see this. Annie followed him back to the study. Karen had circled 6 transactions in red. 6 different payments. 6 different dates. Every one of them led to the same company, Whitmore Gaming Holdings. Richard placed the page in front of Annie. Whatever Charles Whitmore told you yesterday, he said. I think his connection to Margaret started long before that phone call. Annie looked at the 6 red circles. For the first time, she understood that the man waiting in the Mercedes had not suddenly appeared in her life. He had already been there, hidden inside numbers she had never been allowed to see. Tiếp nối trực tiếp từ cuối chương 5, không lặp lại tình tiết cũ và giữ nhịp điều tra tăng dần. Richard kept the statement on his desk, while Annie studied the 6 red circles. Whitmore Gaming Holdings, she said. So she was sending him money before he ever called me. That's what the records suggest, Karen Mills replied. We still need to determine why. Annie traced one date with her finger. This one was 2 weeks after I started working here. Karen nodded. Another payment had been made 3 months later. Then, another. The amounts grew each time. Annie looked at Richard. Did you know Charles before all this? I knew of him. That's different. Yes. Richard pulled a chair closer to the desk. Several years ago, one of his financial companies approached Bennett Medical Technologies. For what? They wanted us to move part of an investment portfolio through a fund they managed. Annie frowned. Like stocks? Something similar, except the structure was unnecessarily complicated. The money passed through several companies before reaching the actual investment. Karen looked interested. What was the fund called? Richard turned toward Daniel. Do you remember? North Atlantic Strategic Partners. Karen wrote it down. Richard continued. Their representatives kept avoiding basic questions about ownership and fees. We declined. Was Charles involved personally? Karen asked. He attended the second meeting. What did you think of him? Richard considered the question. I thought he was very comfortable answering questions nobody had asked. Daniel almost smiled. Annie did not. So you thought he was dishonest? I thought I didn't understand where the money was going. That was enough for me. Karen closed the bank statement. That distinction matters. Annie looked at her. Why? Because suspicion isn't evidence. Mr. Bennett deciding not to invest does not prove Charles committed a crime. Annie's frustration showed. But everybody keeps saying things about him. You have the payments. You have what he said to me. And those things matter, Karen said. But if this goes further, we need records that survive more than an argument. Annie rubbed her thumb over the side of her phone. So knowing something and proving it are different. Very different. That seems unfair. Karen gave her a small, tired smile. Sometimes it is. But that same rule protects people when accusations are wrong, Richard added. Justice gets dangerous when people decide certainty is more important than proof. Annie absorbed that without answering. Daniel's phone buzzed. He stepped into the hallway, then returned less than a minute later. Security says there's a woman at the employee entrance asking for Annie. Annie stiffened. Margaret? No. She says she's your aunt. Annie closed her eyes for a second. Aunt Denise. Do you want to see her? I don't know, Richard said. Then you don't have to decide immediately. Annie looked toward the hallway. She'll just call everybody if I don't. Karen gathered her papers. We can take a break. Mrs. Davis appeared at the doorway as Karen and Daniel left. What happened? My aunt is outside. Mrs. Davis read Annie's face. Do you want company? Yes. A few minutes later, Annie met Denise in a small sitting area beside the employee entrance. Richard did not join them. He stayed close enough to be available, but far enough that the conversation remained Annie's. Denise was in her late 40s and still wearing hospital scrubs beneath a denim jacket. The moment Annie entered, Denise stood. "What have you done?" Annie stopped. "Not hello. Not are you all right. Just that. I didn't do anything. Margaret called me from the station crying. She came here to take me to Charles. Margaret says you misunderstood." "I didn't." Denise rubbed both hands across her face. "This family has enough problems without police getting involved." Mrs. Davis remained beside Annie. Annie said, "She tried to make me marry a man because she owes him money." Denise lowered her voice. "Don't say things like that." "Why?" "Because people hear one side and suddenly somebody's life is ruined." Annie stared at the floor instead of her aunt. "My life counts too." Denise's expression changed slightly. "I'm not saying it doesn't. It sounds like you are. I'm saying Margaret took care of you for years." The old pressure returned so quickly Annie almost answered the way she always had. "I know. I'm sorry. I'll fix it." Instead, she said, "She took my paycheck." Denise stopped. "She used my name to borrow money from Mrs. Bennett." "What?" "And the police found payments to Charles." Denise's confidence weakened. "Margaret said the money was for expenses. I never even knew it existed." Denise looked toward Mrs. Davis, then back to Annie. "This Richard Bennett. How much do you actually know about him?" Annie's face tightened. "What does that have to do with anything? You're staying in a billionaire's house after having your stepmother taken away by police. People are going to talk." Annie felt heat rise into her face. "There it is." "What?" "You're more worried about what this looks like than why I was afraid." "That isn't fair." "No, it isn't." Annie's voice shook, but she continued. "I asked Margaret to leave me alone. She came anyway. Charles came with her. I said no. And somehow everyone keeps asking what I did to her." Denise looked away. Mrs. Davis said nothing. She did not need to. After several seconds, Denise picked up her purse. "I just wanted to make sure you understood what you were doing." Annie opened the door for her. "I'm starting to." When Denise left, Annie stood with her hand still on the handle. Mrs. Davis touched her shoulder. "You all right?" "No." "That's an honest answer." Annie gave a weak smile. When she returned to Richard's study, Karen had another file open. Richard noticed Annie's expression but did not ask about Denise. Instead, he said, "Karen found something." Annie sat. Karen rotated her laptop. "We traced 3 of Margaret's payments beyond Whitmore Gaming Holdings." "Beyond?" "The company didn't keep the money." A diagram appeared on the screen. Whitmore Gaming Holdings transferred funds to South Coast Consulting, then to another business registered in Delaware. From there, portions moved into accounts outside the United States. Annie looked at the lines. "Is that normal?" "It can be," Karen said. "Companies transfer money internationally every day. What interests us is the pattern." "What pattern?" "Small companies with no obvious reason to be doing business with one another, moving money quickly through several accounts." Richard asked, "Money laundering?" "Too early to say." Karen enlarged one transfer, but this account has appeared in another investigation. Annie looked at her. "What kind of investigation?" Karen did not answer immediately. "One involving illegal gambling." Annie's eyes returned to the screen. Charles Whitmore was no longer simply the man who had waited in a Mercedes outside the gate. His name now sat at the center of a financial trail that seemed to keep moving every time investigators touched it. Then Karen's phone rang. She listened for less than a minute. When she ended the call, her expression had changed. "What is it?" Richard asked. Karen looked at Annie. "We've received authorization to review additional financial records connected to Margaret. And there may be more than gambling debt here." Annie's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. Karen closed the laptop. "We need to find out how many other people have been sending money into the same network." By late afternoon, the investigation had moved beyond Margaret's bank statements. Karen Mills returned to Bennett Estate with Officer Reynolds and a digital evidence technician named Luis Ortega. Margaret's phone had been secured during the earlier investigation because of the threats, the financial questions, and the messages connected to Charles Whitmore. Now, with authorization in place, the contents were being reviewed more closely. Annie sat at the long table in Richard's secondary office. Her own phone rested beside her, screen down. She had stopped checking the missed calls from relatives. Karen opened a printed sheet. We found messages between Margaret and Charles. Annie's shoulders tightened. Richard noticed, but he did not interrupt. Karen continued. Some are about money, some are about you. Annie looked at the paper. What did they say? Karen did not immediately hand it over. I want to warn you first. The wording is unpleasant. You already know what she thinks of me. That doesn't always make it easier to read. Annie held out her hand. Please. Karen gave her the page. The first message was from Margaret. I can't keep covering the interest. You know that. Charles had replied. Then stop pretending you have another option. A later exchange mentioned Annie by name. Margaret. She's refusing. Charles. She's young. She'll do what she's told once she understands the alternative. Annie stopped reading. Mrs. Davis, who had joined them, noticed her hand begin to shake. Do you want me to take it? No. Annie forced herself to continue. Another message had been sent 2 days earlier. Margaret. She won't agree if I ask her directly. Charles. Bring her Saturday. Debt disappears after the papers are signed. Annie lowered the page. What papers? Karen said. We don't know yet. Marriage papers? Possibly. Possibly something financial. We don't guess if we can verify. Annie looked at Richard. He told me I'd have a good life. Richard's expression remained fixed. He was talking like it was a business deal. Karen folded her hands over the file. That is what we're trying to understand. Luis turned his laptop toward Karen. I found another thread. What kind? Different contact. No name saved. Just a number. Karen moved beside him. Annie watched the two of them scan the screen. What is it? Luis enlarged the conversation. The messages did not mention Annie. They mentioned payments, dates, account numbers, location. One line read, Toronto cleared. Another, Singapore delayed again. Another, Macau wants confirmation before release. Annie frowned. What does that mean? Luis answered carefully. It means people are discussing money moving through more than one country. Karen added, that by itself isn't illegal. We need context. There were more messages. A Caribbean bank account. A digital wallet address. A company registered in Delaware. Another in Ontario. Several transfers marked as consulting fees. Richard looked at Karen. Does Margaret understand what she's involved in? That's one of the questions. Annie asked. Could she just be paying Charles? She could, Karen said. But these messages suggest she may have been helping move money. Knowingly, or not. Annie sat back. She can barely keep track of her own bills. Mrs. Davis said, people who are drowning sometimes grab whatever rope is thrown at them. Karen glanced at her. Even if the rope is tied to something worse. Annie looked again at the messages. She kept saying she just needed one big win. Richard asked, did she gamble online? All the time. Through Whitmore? I don't know. She used different apps. Louise typed something. Do you remember names? Annie listed the ones she could. 2 were familiar gambling apps. 1 was not. Louise stopped typing. Say the last one again. Golden Harbor. He searched the extracted data. Golden Harbor what? I don't know, that's what she called it. Karen leaned closer. Louise found the entry. Golden Harbor Leisure. Richard asked, you know it? Karen did not answer immediately. Louise opened another window. Company appears in 3 prior financial intelligence reports. Annie looked from one face to another. What does that mean? Karen said, it means investigators have seen the name before. For gambling? Among other things. Annie pressed her palms against the table. So Charles is part of something bigger. We're not ready to say that. You keep saying that. Karen met her eyes. I know it's frustrating. It feels like every answer comes with another reason not to say the answer. That's because we're trying not to make promises we can't support. Annie looked down. Richard spoke. Karen's right. Annie gave him a tired look. I know. He continued anyway. People with money survive accusations all the time. Evidence is what changes that. Louise suddenly raised one hand. Hold on. Everyone turned toward him. He had opened a spreadsheet recovered from a deleted folder on Margaret's phone. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Some entries were marked with initials. Others had short notes beside them. Paid. Extended. Rollidor. Secured. One line included Margaret's initials. MC. Extended again. Another line beneath it read, alternative arrangement approved. Annie went very still. Karen enlarged the line. Richard's voice lowered. Is there a date? Yes. When? Louise checked. 3 days ago. The same day, Margaret told Annie someone was waiting for her. Annie's lips parted. Mrs. Davis placed one hand over Annie's wrist. Karen said, "We need to send this upstairs." "Upstairs where?" Annie asked. "To people who handle larger financial cases." Richard understood before Annie did. "Federal?" Karen nodded. "Possibly." Annie looked back at the screen. "All because of Margaret's phone?" "No," Karen said. "Because the phone matches things other investigators have already been seeing." That answer frightened Annie more than anything else Karen had said. She had spent the entire day thinking Margaret's gambling debt was the center of the story. Now she understood it might be only one line in someone else's ledger. 2 hours later, as the sun dropped behind the trees surrounding the estate, Daniel came into the office. "Richard." "What?" Security called from the front gate. Annie looked up immediately. "Margaret?" "No." Daniel glanced toward Karen. 2 black SUVs just arrived. Government plates. Karen stood. "That was fast." Richard walked toward the window. Annie stayed in her chair. She had asked for help because she did not want to get into Charles Whitmore's car. Now people from outside Atlanta were arriving because of what had been found on her stepmother's phone. Mrs. Davis touched Annie's shoulder. "You all right?" Annie watched the 2 SUVs stop near the main entrance. "No." Then, after a moment, she added, "But I'm not leaving." For the first time, those words did not sound like fear. They sounded like a decision. The 2 SUVs stopped near the front entrance, and 3 people stepped out. One of them was a woman in her 50s wearing a navy suit and carrying a slim black case. Beside her was a younger man with a laptop bag and another man who showed identification to the security officer before they were escorted inside. Annie remained near Mrs. Davis. Richard went to meet them in the foyer. The woman introduced herself first. "Special Agent Laura Bennett, Financial Crimes." Richard glanced at the surname. She caught it immediately. "No relation." For the first time all afternoon, Daniel smiled. Agent Bennett did not. "We've been asked to review information connected to several entities that appeared on the phone recovered from Margaret Carter." Richard nodded toward the study. "Karen Mills is already inside." "Good." Annie watched them approach. Agent Bennett noticed her uniform, then looked at Karen. "This is Annie Carter?" "Yes." Annie straightened. Agent Bennett did not speak to her like someone fragile. "Miss Carter, I understand you've had a long day." "That's one way to put it." A faint smile appeared on the agent's face. "Fair enough." She set the black case on the table. "I want to be clear about something before we start. You are not under investigation." Annie exhaled. Richard noticed. "You may have information that helps us understand how Margaret Carter became connected to people we've been looking at for some time." Annie looked toward the laptop Louise had left open. "Charles?" Agent Bennett pulled out a chair. "Among others." Richard asked, "How long has Whitmore been on your radar?" The agent considered her answer. "Long enough that I'm not going to discuss an active investigation in detail." Richard nodded. Annie asked, "Does he run illegal gambling?" "We believe businesses connected to him may be part of a larger network." "Maybe?" Agent Bennett looked at her directly. "That word matters." Annie almost laughed. "Everybody keeps telling me that." "I'm guessing Karen has already given you the lecture." "She has." "Then I'll spare you." Karen folded her arms. "I appreciate that." Agent Bennett opened a folder. "What we can tell you is that Golden Harbor Leisure has appeared in financial reports connected to online gambling activity, unusual transfers, and accounts in several countries. We've never had a clean line showing how some of the money moved from individual players into those companies." She tapped the printout from Margaret's phone. "This helps." Annie looked at the rows of numbers again. "Margaret was one of the players?" "Probably." "Was she working for them too?" "We don't know." Annie shook her head. "She isn't some criminal mastermind. No one said she was. She spends money she doesn't have. She thinks one win will fix everything." Agent Bennett nodded once. "That description fits more people in these cases than you might think." Mrs. Davis, who had been quiet until then, said, "That's how they keep them coming back." The agent looked at her. "Exactly." Annie rubbed her palms against the fabric of her uniform. "So how does it work?" Agent Bennett leaned back slightly. "A person loses. The platform offers credit. They lose again. Then someone offers another way to cover the balance." "What kind of way?" "Property, loans, business transfers, sometimes moving money through accounts that don't appear connected to gambling." Annie's eyes narrowed. "And if they still can't pay?" "That depends on who they owe." Annie looked toward Richard. Neither of them said Charles's name. They did not need to. Agent Bennett continued. We're interested in whether Margaret was only paying losses, or whether she was also being used to move money for people above her. Karen opened the spreadsheet. There are multiple entries marked, extended, and rolled over. Agent Bennett nodded. Typical debt language. Louise pointed to Margaret's initials. And then this. Alternative arrangement approved. Annie looked at the screen. That was me. Agent Bennett did not answer immediately. It may refer to you. It does. Why are you certain? Because 3 days later she came here with Charles. That landed differently now. The agent wrote something down. Did Charles ever say what would happen if you refused? Not directly. What did he say? That I shouldn't make things harder for everyone. Anything else? He said Margaret had made promises. Agent Bennett wrote again. Richard asked, could that be enough to connect him to coercion? Possibly, but we build cases with patterns, not one sentence. Annie leaned forward. What if there are other people like Margaret? The agent looked at her. What do you mean? People who owed money and then got offered another way out. Karen and Agent Bennett exchanged a look. That, the agent said, is exactly what we need to find out. The younger federal analyst opened his laptop. We already have transaction clusters from Georgia, Florida, Ontario, and Singapore. Annie frowned. So this isn't just Atlanta. No. How many people? We don't know yet. Annie sat back. For the first time, the problem felt too large to fit inside the Bennett house. Mrs. Davis put a hand near Annie's, not touching until Annie moved her own hand closer. Richard asked, what do you need from us? Copies of the Bennett loan records, Annie's messages with Margaret and Whitmore, any camera footage from today, and anything showing Charles was physically here. You'll have it. Agent Bennett turned to Annie. We may need to speak with you again. Annie nodded. Do I have to? No. That answer surprised her. The agent continued. But your information could matter. Annie looked at Richard. He did not tell her what to do. Mrs. Davis did not either. After a moment, Annie said, then I'll talk. Agent Bennett closed the folder. Good. A phone buzzed on the table. Karen checked the screen. Her expression changed. What? She looked at Agent Bennett. We just got another match. To what? Karen turned the phone so she could see. South Coast Consulting. Agent Bennett's eyes sharpened. Where? Toronto. The analyst immediately began typing. Richard asked, meaning? Agent Bennett gathered the documents. Meaning the company receiving Margaret's money may already be connected to funds moving across the border. Annie looked at the screen filled with names, numbers, and dates. That morning she had wanted only one thing, not to leave with Margaret. Now strangers from federal law enforcement were sitting inside Richard Bennett's house because one woman's gambling debt had opened a path into something far larger. Annie looked at Agent Bennett. If there are other people caught in this, there probably are. Then don't stop with Charles. Agent Bennett studied her for a moment. We don't intend to. That evening, after the agents left, Annie sat with Mrs. Davis in the staff kitchen. A bowl of chicken soup sat between her hands. A local news program played quietly on the television above the refrigerator. Annie barely heard it. Mrs. Davis reached for the remote and switched the television off. Eat. Annie took one spoonful, then another. After a while, she said, This morning I thought I was scared of one woman. Mrs. Davis broke a cracker over her soup. And now? Annie looked toward the dark window. Now I think she was scared too. Mrs. Davis nodded. That doesn't excuse what she did. I know. Good. Annie lowered her spoon. But if Charles did this to her, how many other people did he do it to? Mrs. Davis looked at her across the table. That sounds like a question somebody is finally going to have to answer. The next morning, before Annie finished her first cup of coffee, Daniel came into the kitchen holding his phone. Annie. She looked up. What happened? He hesitated. Your name is online. The spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. And suddenly the investigation was no longer staying behind the gates of Bennett Estate. Daniel placed his phone on the kitchen table. Annie looked at the screen. The headline came from a local Atlanta website. Housekeeper at Billionaire's estate linked to police incident involving gaming executive. Her name appeared in the second paragraph. Annie Carter. She read it twice. How did they get my name? Daniel shook his head. We don't know yet. Mrs. Davis came around the table. What does it say? Not much that's accurate. Daniel scrolled. The article described Margaret as Annie's stepmother and mentioned Charles Whitmore, but the writer called the incident a family disagreement that had drawn police attention at Richard Bennett's estate. There was no mention of the messages, nothing about the debt arrangement, nothing about the financial investigation. Richard entered the kitchen while Annie was still reading. What happened? Daniel handed him the phone. Richard read the article. Annie watched his face. They make it sound like I brought everything here. They don't have the facts, Richard said. But they have my name. Richard handed the phone back. We'll ask counsel to find out whether anything protected was disclosed. Annie's own phone started vibrating on the table. Aunt Denise. Annie let it ring. Then another call came. A cousin. Then another. Mrs. Davis reached over and turned the phone face down. You can answer when you're ready. A message appeared before the screen went dark. How could you do this to Margaret? Annie read it anyway. Another followed. People are saying that Billionaire put you up to this. Then, call me before this gets worse. Annie pushed her chair back. I need to go home. Richard looked at her. To Margaret's house? No, I mean leave here. Where would you go? I don't know. Mrs. Davis crossed her arms. That sounds like a plan made by somebody who hasn't finished breakfast. I can't stay here while people say this. Richard pulled out the chair across from her but remained standing. What exactly are they saying? That I turned against my family because some rich white man told me to. Richard's expression changed slightly. Annie continued, they're going to make it look like you found some poor black housekeeper and decided to run her life for her. Do you think that's what happened? No. Then don't defend me. She looked at him. Richard said, I don't need you explaining me to anyone. That isn't the point. I know. Do you? Her voice rose before she could stop it. Richard did not react. Annie pressed on. If people see you, they see a billionaire. They see the house, the cars, the company. If they see me, they see the uniform. Mrs. Davis watched her closely. Annie pointed toward the phone. They don't know what Margaret said to me. They don't know what Charles wanted. They just see a girl who cleans somebody else's house standing next to a man with enough money to have gates around his. Richard nodded. That's true. Annie had expected an argument. His agreement took some of the force out of her anger. So what am I supposed to do with that? You decide what you want to do next. I just said I should leave. Richard nodded toward the hallway. If you want another job, I'll give you a reference today. Mrs. Davis can help with anything payroll needs. Annie blinked. You'd let me quit? Of course. Mrs. Davis gave Richard a sideways look. She asked that as if you keep employees in the basement. Annie nearly laughed. Nearly, Richard continued. But if you're leaving because strangers online made you ashamed to work here, think carefully before you hand them that decision. Annie folded her arms. That sounds like you want me to stay. I want you to know the difference between leaving and being pushed out. The phone vibrated again. This time Annie answered. Aunt Denise. Her aunt started before Annie could say anything. Annie, what is going on? People are sharing your picture. What picture? Your work badge photo, I think. Somebody posted it. Annie closed her eyes. Denise continued. Margaret says Richard Bennett is keeping you from speaking to the family. That's not true. She says you won't answer her. I don't want to answer her. She's your stepmother. And I said no. Denise lowered her voice. People are talking about that man. Charles? No, Bennett. Annie looked at Richard. He moved toward the coffee machine, deliberately giving her the conversation. What are they saying? That nobody gives something for nothing. Annie's face tightened. So that's what you called to ask me? I'm trying to protect you. Then ask if I'm safe. Denise stopped. Annie waited. Her aunt finally said, Are you? Yes. Are you being pressured to stay there? No. Did Richard tell you to call police? No. I told him I didn't want to go with Margaret. He listened. Denise sighed. This is messy. It was messy before anybody knew about it. When the call ended, Annie stood near the table holding her phone. Mrs. Davis said, Come sit down. I'm not hungry. I didn't say eat. Annie sat. Mrs. Davis took the chair beside her. You know what people do when the truth makes them uncomfortable? What? They changed the subject. Annie looked toward her. Margaret tried to trade your future for a debt. Charles sat outside waiting for you. But now people want to discuss Richard's skin color, his bank account, your job, your attitude, anything except what happened. Annie looked down at her uniform. That part still matters. It does. Mrs. Davis touched the table between them. You know what doesn't help? Turning Richard into the hero. Richard glanced over from the coffee machine. I'm comfortable with that. Mrs. Davis ignored him. Make the truth the hero. Richard can be the man who opened a door. Annie considered the words. Then she picked up her phone. What are you doing? Richard asked. Calling payroll. Why? I want to make sure my next shift is still on the schedule. Mrs. Davis smiled. Richard nodded once. Annie made the call. She did not stay because she owed Richard anything. She stayed because the work was hers to keep or leave, and this time nobody else was going to choose for her. Later that afternoon, Karen Mills arrived carrying another folder. The news story was forgotten the moment she placed it in front of Annie. We found something in the older financial records. Annie looked at her. What? Karen sat across from her. Money your father left for you. Annie stopped moving. Karen's next words came carefully. Annie, there should have been enough to help you start college. And just like that, the messages on her phone no longer felt like the worst thing she would learn that day. Annie looked at Karen as if she had misheard her. Enough for college? Karen nodded and opened the folder. Your father had a life insurance policy and a separate custodial account. Both named you as the beneficiary. Annie pulled the papers closer but did not touch them. How much? Karen gave her the total. Annie's lips parted. That was mine? Yes. And Margaret knew? She was the adult authorized to manage the funds until you reached the required age. Annie glanced at Richard, then back at the documents. Where is it now? Karen did not answer right away. That was enough. Annie pushed the folder away. No. Mrs. Davis, sitting beside her, shifted closer. Karen said, Most of the money is gone. Annie shook her head. No. She told me there wasn't anything. She said Dad left bills. We found bills too, Karen said. But they do not account for these withdrawals. She turned one page. A column of transactions appeared. Cash withdrawal, online gaming payment, casino charge, transfer, another withdrawal. Annie read down the list. The dates continued for years. She used it. Karen said, the records indicate she used a substantial portion. For gambling? Much of it appears connected to gambling or accounts we are already reviewing. Annie stood. Her chair scraped across the floor. I need a minute. Richard moved away from the doorway so she had space. Annie crossed to the window, then stopped. Her hands pressed against the sides of her uniform. I could have gone to school. No one answered. I thought I couldn't afford it. Mrs. Davis said softly, Annie, I worked weekends. I picked up extra shifts. I kept telling myself maybe next year. Her voice broke. And she had the money? Karen replied. At one point, yes. Annie turned. She watched me fill out applications. Karen lowered her eyes to the file. She watched me tell people I wasn't going because I couldn't pay for it. Richard finally spoke. Annie. What? You have every right to be angry. I'm not angry. The words came too fast. Mrs. Davis gave her a look. Annie wiped her face. All right, I'm angry. She walked back to the table and pointed at the transactions. This one. What is it? Karen leaned closer. $7,500 transferred to Peachtree Leisure Services. And this? $4,000 to South Coast Consulting. And this one? A casino cash advance. Annie kept pointing until her hand began to shake. How does somebody spend this much and still ask me for my paycheck? Karen answered carefully. Addiction doesn't usually stop when the money is gone. Annie let out a short breath. So she just kept taking. She appears to have kept looking for new sources. My father's money. Mrs. Bennett's money. My paycheck. Richard looked at the pages. And then Charles. Annie lowered herself into the chair again. The connection was simple now. Margaret had not fallen into one debt. She had been feeding it for years. Karen turned to another document. There is something else. Annie gave a tired laugh. Of course there is. This account received a deposit after your father's insurance payment. Margaret moved part of it into an account in her own name. Can she do that? She had authority to manage the money for your benefit. That does not mean she could use it for herself. So what happens? We document where it went. If the evidence supports fraud or misuse, that becomes part of the case. Annie leaned forward. Can I get any of it back? Possibly, but I don't want to promise you an amount. Annie nodded. She had heard enough careful answers by now to understand why. Richard asked, Is Charles connected to these older transfers? Not the earliest ones. His companies began appearing later. How much later? About 3 years ago. Annie looked at Karen. So before that, she was gambling somewhere else. That is what the records suggest. Mrs. Davis reached across the table. Annie placed her hand in hers this time without hesitation. I keep thinking I should have noticed. Mrs. Davis squeezed her fingers. You keep giving yourself jobs that were never yours. Annie looked at her. What does that mean? You were supposed to earn your paycheck. Do your work. Make your plans. You were not supposed to audit the adult handling your money. Annie's eyes filled again. She always said I was expensive. Mrs. Davis's face tightened. She said I should be grateful she kept me around. Every time I wanted something, she'd tell me how much she already spent. Richard's voice was low. And now you know where some of the money came from. Annie nodded. She made me feel guilty for money that was already mine. Nobody tried to soften it. That helped more than Annie expected. Karen closed the folder. We can stop for today. No. You've been through a lot. I want to know everything. You don't have to absorb all of it at once. I know. Annie drew the folder back toward herself. But I'm tired of finding out things about my own life last. Richard looked at her for a moment, then nodded. All right. Karen opened the file again. They worked for another hour. Not every transaction was suspicious. Groceries appeared. Utility bills. Medical expenses. Ordinary purchases mixed with gambling charges. And unexplained transfers. That somehow made it harder. Margaret had not taken everything in one dramatic act. She had taken pieces. A few thousand here, a transfer there. Annie's paycheck whenever she needed more. By evening, Annie could no longer look at numbers. She walked out to the covered back porch with a glass of water. Richard found her there several minutes later. He remained near the doorway. I can go if you want to be alone. You can stay. He took the chair across from her. For a while, neither spoke. Then Annie said, I used to think graduating high school was probably as far as I was going. Richard looked at her. Do you still think that? I don't know. That's a different answer. She rubbed her thumb over the side of the glass. I feel like she took years from me. Richard nodded. She took choices. Annie looked at him. That sounds worse. It may be. She waited. Richard continued. But don't give her the next ones. Annie's eyes dropped to her lap. What if I'm already behind? Behind who? Everybody. That is a race people invent when they want to punish themselves. Annie gave him a small look. You always talk like that? No. Usually people pay me to talk about quarterly revenue. A quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It surprised both of them. Richard stood. Get some dinner. I'm not hungry. Mrs. Davis will disagree. She always does. That is one of her strengths. He started toward the door. Mr. Bennett? Richard turned. Thank you for not telling me what I should do with the money if they recover it. It isn't my money. Annie nodded. That answer mattered. Later that night, she returned to the staff residence and placed her high school graduation tassel on the desk beside her phone. For months it had felt like a souvenir from something finished. Now she looked at it differently, not as proof of where she had stopped, as proof of where she could begin again. Her phone lit up, a message from an unknown number. Annie expected another relative. Instead, it was Margaret. Please talk to me. I can explain. Annie read the message once. Then another appeared. I never meant for any of this to happen. A third followed less than a minute later. Please, Annie. They're coming after me now. Annie's hand stopped above the screen. For the first time since Margaret had been taken from the Bennett property, Annie saw something in those words she had not expected. Fear. Annie read Margaret's last message again. Please, Annie. They're coming after me now. She did not answer. A fourth message appeared. I need to see you. Just 5 minutes. Annie set the phone on the desk and stepped away from it. She wanted to believe the fear in Margaret's words changed something. Instead, it made everything harder. Anger had been easier to understand when Margaret was demanding, accusing, taking. Fear made her look human again. Mrs. Davis found Annie 20 minutes later in the staff kitchen, standing beside the coffee maker without making coffee. You look like you're waiting for that machine to solve something. Annie handed her the phone. Mrs. Davis read the messages. What do you want to do? I don't know. That's allowed. She says people are coming after her. She may be telling the truth. Annie looked at her. You think I should help? I think those are two different questions. Annie frowned. Mrs. Davis placed the phone on the counter. Whether she's afraid is one question. Whether that gives her the right to ask you for something is another. Before Annie could answer, Daniel entered. Richard wants you both in the study. Annie's stomach tightened. What happened? Security has someone at the gate. She knew before he said the name. Margaret? Daniel nodded. 5 minutes later, Annie stood beside Richard in front of the security monitor. Margaret waited outside the main gate. No expensive coat this time. No large handbag. Her hair was messy, and she kept looking toward the road. Richard said, "She is asking to speak with you." Annie folded her arms. "She's not supposed to come here. She hasn't entered the property. Can you make her leave?" "Yes." Annie looked at the screen. Margaret pressed the intercom button again. "Annie, please. I know you're in there." Her voice sounded smaller than it had 2 days earlier. Richard looked at Annie. "You decide." Mrs. Davis stood nearby. Annie asked, "If I talk to her, can I do it at the gate?" "Yes." "With security there?" "Yes." "And you?" Richard shook his head. "Only if you want me there." Annie thought for a moment. "No, Mrs. Davis." Mrs. Davis picked up her cardigan from the chair. "Then let's go." They met Margaret on the inside of the closed gate. A security officer remained a few feet from Annie. Another stood near the guard station. Margaret rushed forward until the gate stopped her. Thank God. Annie did not move closer. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you." "You could have called. You weren't answering." "That doesn't mean come here." Margaret's face tightened. "I'm sorry." Annie had heard those words from her many times, but never like this. "What do you want?" Margaret glanced toward the security officers. "Can we talk alone?" "No." "Annie." "No." Margaret pressed her fingers against the iron bars. "Charles knows I talked to the police." "You did talk to them." "I had no choice." Annie almost laughed. "You keep saying that." "This is different." "How?" Margaret looked toward the road again. "They're pressuring me." "Who?" "People connected to Charles." "What people?" "I don't know their names." "Then tell the investigators." "I can't." "Why not?" Margaret's voice dropped. "Because they'll make it worse." Annie looked at her for several seconds. "What do they want?" "Money." "You don't have any." "I know." "So what are you asking me for?" Margaret's eyes filled. "I need help." Annie felt the old reflex rise inside her. "Fix it. Make things easier." Stop Margaret from getting upset. This time she did nothing. Margaret continued. "They said I have 48 hours. To do what?" "Pie." "And if you don't?" Margaret swallowed. "They said I'd regret it." Mrs. Davis asked. "Was that the exact wording?" Margaret looked at her. "Who are you?" "Someone making sure Annie doesn't have to handle this alone." Margaret turned back to Annie. "They're going to kill me if I don't pay." Annie's face changed, but she did not step forward. "Then go to the police." "You don't understand these people." "I understand enough." "No, you don't. Charles has people everywhere." "That's what you told me when you wanted me scared." "I was trying to make you listen." "You were trying to make me go with him." Margaret wiped her face. "I never wanted you hurt." Annie's voice became quieter. "Then why did you offer me?" Margaret looked away. "That isn't what happened." "Then tell me what happened." "I was desperate." "That's not an answer." "He said there were ways to settle the debt. And one of those ways was me." Margaret said nothing. Annie stepped closer to the gate. Not close enough for Margaret to reach her. "Say it." "Annie, please. Say what you were willing to do." Margaret's mouth trembled. "I thought once you got to know him." "No. He has money. He could give you things I never could." "No. You wouldn't have to work here." Annie's expression hardened. "You still think that makes it better?" "I thought you could have a good life." "You thought you could get rid of your debt." Margaret lowered her eyes. Annie asked, "Did you ever plan to tell me about Dad's money?" Margaret looked up sharply. So she knew. Annie saw it immediately. "The investigators found it." Margaret whispered, "I can explain." "Did you use it for gambling?" "I was going to put it back." "Did you use it?" "Yes." Annie's throat tightened. "And the money from Mrs. Bennet?" Margaret closed her eyes. "Yes." "My paycheck?" Annie, "Yes or no?" "Yes." Annie nodded once. Margaret began crying harder. "I always thought I could win it back. Every time I got close, I thought one more bet would fix everything. But every time you lost, you found something else to use. I was sick. You still knew what you were doing to me." Margaret reached through the gate. Annie stepped away. "I raised you." There it was again. The sentence Margaret always used when nothing else worked. This time Annie did not apologize. "You didn't lose me because of one bad day." Margaret stopped crying. Annie looked directly at her. "You spent years betting with things that were never yours to gamble with." Margaret's hand slowly dropped. "I'm asking you to forgive me." I'm asking you to tell the police what you know about Charles. Will you talk to me after? Annie shook her head. Don't make telling the truth another deal. Margaret looked as if the words hurt. Maybe they did. Mrs. Davis touched Annie lightly on the arm. We should go. Annie turned away. Margaret called after her. Annie. She stopped, but did not turn. I really am sorry. Annie stood there for a moment. Then she walked back toward the house. That night, she changed into her work clothes for the next morning and placed her phone on the bedside table. At 11:18, the screen lit up. Unknown number. Annie opened the message. You should have gotten in the car. A photograph appeared underneath. It showed Annie standing inside Bennett Estate near a window. The picture had been taken from outside. Annie went cold. The photograph was recent, taken after Richard had increased security. She left the staff residence and crossed quickly toward the main house. Richard was still awake when she found him. She held out the phone. He read the message. Then he looked at the photograph. Neither needed to ask whether Charles Whitmore was finished with her. He wasn't. Richard read the message twice, then handed Annie's phone to Daniel. Call Agent Bennett. Daniel was already reaching for his own phone. Annie stood beside the desk with her arms folded tightly across herself. A few minutes earlier, she had been thinking about sleep, tomorrow's shift, whether Margaret would contact her again. Now a photograph taken through a window had reduced everything to one question. How did somebody get that close? Richard looked at the image again. I don't know yet, but you added security. Yes. So it didn't work. It means we need to find the gap. Annie shook her head. They know where I am. They knew where you worked before tonight. That isn't better. No, it isn't. Richard did not try to soften the answer. Agent Laura Bennett arrived less than an hour later with another federal investigator. Security brought them through the main entrance while Daniel pulled camera recordings from the previous 48 hours. Agent Bennett took Annie's phone, photographed the message, then placed it in an evidence sleeve after Annie agreed. Do you recognize the number? No. Have you received anything from it before? No. What about the angle of the photograph? Annie looked at the image again. She was standing near one of the tall windows connecting the main hallway to the east garden. That's near the staircase. Richard pointed toward the screen. The photograph appears to have been taken from beyond the garden wall. Daniel shook his head. There's a camera covering that section. Pull it up. They reviewed the footage. Nothing at first. Employees crossed the garden during the afternoon. A delivery van arrived and left. One groundskeeper worked near the hedges. Then Daniel stopped the recording. There, a figure appeared beyond the edge of the property, partly blocked by landscaping. The person never crossed the gate, never approached the house. He remained on public ground beyond the wall long enough to take the photograph, then walked away. Agent Bennett enlarged the image. Can you identify him? Annie shook her head. Richard asked, Can you? The agent studied the frame. Not from this. So someone can stand outside my property and photograph people through the windows? If they remain where they're legally allowed to stand, that question becomes complicated. Annie gave a short, humorless laugh. Everything becomes complicated. Agent Bennett looked at her. Yes, unfortunately. Richard turned to Daniel. Close the curtains on every ground floor room facing the road. Increase patrols along the perimeter. Annie immediately said, For how long? Richard looked at her. As long as necessary. That could mean anything. Agent Bennett stepped in before the exchange could harden. We're recommending that you spend a few days somewhere that isn't associated with Bennett Estate or Margaret. Annie looked at her. You want me moved again? Temporarily. Where? We would arrange it. So I don't get to know? You would know. The location simply wouldn't be public. Annie looked toward Richard. He said, I think you should consider it. Of course you do. Mrs. Davis had entered quietly during the conversation. She watched Annie for a moment before speaking. Sweetheart, nobody here is trying to make decisions for you. It feels exactly like that. Agent Bennett folded her hands on the table. You can refuse. Annie looked at her. Then why does everybody keep talking like there's only one smart answer? Because there may be one safer answer. That doesn't make it compulsory. Annie walked toward the window, then stopped before reaching it. Someone had taken a photograph through that glass. She changed direction and sat on the edge of a chair. I spent years having Margaret tell me where to go, what to give her, what I was supposed to do. Then Charles decides I'm part of some arrangement. Now people who are helping me are packing me somewhere else. Richard remained near the desk. That isn't the same thing. I know. She looked at him. That's what makes it worse. Richard frowned. Annie searched for the words. You're trying to protect me. Agent Bennett is doing her job. Nobody here is asking for anything in return. I understand all of that. Then what are you angry about? My life still keeps moving because somebody else did something. No one answered immediately. Annie continued, when do I get to live somewhere because I chose it? When do I wake up and decide what my day looks like before somebody else changes it? Richard's expression softened. I don't know. Annie seemed surprised. You don't? No. She had probably expected advice. Richard gave her none. Safety sometimes asks things from us, he said. But it shouldn't make you forget whose life it is. Agent Bennett nodded. You can stay here. We can increase security and work around it. Or you can move temporarily. Neither option changes the investigation. Annie considered both choices. Would leaving help you? It may reduce unnecessary attention around you while we work on identifying the person who took the photograph. For a few days? That's what I'm recommending. Annie looked at Mrs. Davis. What would you do? Mrs. Davis shook her head. No. Annie blinked. No? You're asking me to decide because you're tired. I am tired. I know. But if I answer for you, we're doing the same thing everybody else has been doing. Annie looked down at her hands. After a while, she said, I'll go. Richard asked, because you want to? Because I think it makes sense. She looked toward Agent Bennett. But I want to know where I'm going, how long I'm expected to stay, and who has access. You'll have all of that. And if I decide I want to come back, we discuss the security situation with you. We don't lock you somewhere. Annie nodded. Then I'll go. Richard called Daniel. Have someone help her with whatever she needs. I can pack my own bag, Annie said. Richard stopped. Right. Mrs. Davis smiled slightly. That one you walked into. Annie gave the first genuine smile of the night. Upstairs in the staff residence, she opened the small suitcase she had used when moving onto the property. She packed 2 pairs of jeans, several shirts, toiletries, her work uniform and the graduation tassel that had been sitting on the desk. Mrs. Davis stood in the doorway. You're taking the uniform? I have a shift. You may not be back for it. I know. Then why take it? Annie folded it carefully. Because I'm coming back. Mrs. Davis nodded. That sounds more like you. The next morning, Annie left Bennett Estate in an unmarked vehicle arranged through the investigators. She knew the address. She knew who would be there. She had Agent Bennett's number written on paper in addition to having it saved in her phone. For once, information was not being withheld from her in the name of knowing what was best. By noon, the photograph had given investigators something useful. A traffic camera farther down the road, the rental agreement led to a name connected to one of Charles Whitmore's smaller companies. Agent Bennett called Richard first, then Annie. We identified the man. Annie sat at a kitchen table in the temporary residence. Does he work for Charles? His financial records show payments from a company tied to Whitmore. What happens now? We talked to him. And Charles? Brief pause. We're getting closer. Annie looked at the suitcase beside the wall. A week earlier, hearing that might have made her want to hide. Instead, she asked, closer to proving it? Agent Bennett seemed to appreciate the question. Yes. Annie nodded. Good. Before ending the call, Agent Bennett added, there's something else. Whitmore has begun moving assets and canceling appointments. His Atlanta residence has very little activity. Annie understood. He's leaving. We think he may try. After the call, Annie sat for several minutes with the phone in her hand. Then she opened her community college website. She had been looking at the admissions page on and off since learning about her father's money. This time she did not close it. She created an account, entered her name, and began the application. Somewhere in Atlanta, investigators were trying to stop Charles Whitmore from disappearing. Annie could not control when they found him. She could control what she did with the next hour. For the first time in days, that felt like enough. By late afternoon, Annie had finished the first half of her community college application when Agent Bennett called again. We found Whitmore. Annie stopped typing. Where? At a private aviation terminal outside Atlanta. Was he leaving? He had luggage, 2 phones and a reservation under another company name. Annie closed the laptop. Did you arrest him? We detained him while agents confirmed the warrant. He's now in federal custody. The words should have brought relief. Instead, Annie felt something closer to disbelief. That's it? No, Agent Bennett said. It means we have him in one place. It doesn't mean the case is finished. What is he saying? Very little. His attorney arrived quickly. Annie pictured Charles in the black Mercedes outside Bennett Estate, acting as if the decision about her future had already been made. Does he still say none of this has anything to do with him? He says Margaret was a gambler who made her own choices. He says his companies are legitimate and the messages were taken out of context. Annie almost laughed. He told me she had made promises. I know. He waited outside the house for me. I know that too. Annie lowered her voice. Then why can't you just prove it? We're getting closer. But Charles is one person. We're trying to establish what the companies around him were doing, and who else was involved. Annie looked toward the small suitcase near the wall. What do you need? Possibly Margaret. That answer surprised her. What about her? She contacted her attorney this morning and asked about cooperating. Annie's hand tightened around the phone. Why? Because the evidence is getting stronger, and she knows that. That sounds like Margaret. Agent Bennett paused. She also asked to speak with you. No. The answer came so quickly that Annie surprised herself. You don't have to. She already came to the gate. I'm aware. She wants me to make her feel better. That may be part of it. Annie looked at the unfinished college application on the screen. What does she have that you need? Passwords, account access, names that appear only as initials in some records. We believe she had direct contact with more people in Whitmore's network than she originally admitted. And she won't tell you unless I talk to her? That is not a condition we will accept. Annie relaxed slightly. What did she ask for? Forgiveness. Annie closed her eyes. Of course, even now, Margaret was trying to turn one thing into payment for another. I'll talk to her. Agent Bennett hesitated. You just said no. I changed my mind. You don't owe us that. I know. That was exactly why Annie agreed. The meeting took place the next morning in a federal building in Atlanta. Annie returned from the temporary residence with Agent Bennett. Richard did not come. Mrs. Davis offered, but Annie asked to go alone with the agent. Margaret sat on the other side of a conference table with her attorney. She looked tired. No jewelry. No expensive handbag. Just a plain blouse and both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. When Annie entered, Margaret stood. Annie, sit down. Margaret obeyed. Her attorney introduced himself, but Annie barely heard his name. Margaret looked at her. I'm glad you came. I'm not here to make you feel better. Margaret's eyes dropped. I deserve that. I'm not here to punish you either. Then why are you here? Because Agent Bennett says you know things. Margaret glanced toward her attorney. He said, my client is prepared to assist investigators. Annie looked at Margaret, then assist them. Margaret's mouth tightened. I wanted to talk to you first. Why? Because I don't know if I'll get another chance. To do what? To tell you I'm sorry. Annie folded her hands on the table. You already told me. I mean it. I believe you're sorry. Margaret looked almost relieved. Then Annie continued. That doesn't fix it. The relief disappeared. I know. Do you? Margaret's eyes filled. I ruined everything. No. You ruined a lot. That's different. Margaret looked confused. Annie said, you don't get to tell me everything is ruined. My life is still happening. Margaret lowered her head. I didn't know how far Charles's people went. You knew enough to be afraid of them. Yes. And you still tried to send me with him. Margaret whispered. Yes. Annie waited. No excuse came this time. That mattered. Margaret looked up. If I tell them everything, will you forgive me? Annie felt something settle inside her. Not anger. Clarity. No. Margaret's face crumpled. Annie, please, tell them the truth because it's true. Don't use it to buy me again. Margaret's attorney looked down at his notes. Agent Bennett said nothing. Margaret covered her mouth with one hand. Annie continued. You used Dad's money because you thought you could win it back. Then Mrs. Bennett's money. Then my paycheck. Then you tried to use me. Every time you lost something, you reached for something else. Margaret nodded through tears. I was scared. So was I. I know. No. I don't think you did. Margaret wiped her face. What happens to us? Annie looked at her. There isn't an us decision today. Margaret's voice dropped. Will there ever be? I don't know. For once, Annie did not fill the uncertainty with a promise. Margaret sat for several seconds, then turned toward her attorney. I'll give them everything. Agent Bennett opened a folder. Start with the accounts. Margaret nodded. Golden Harbor has 3 login systems. Charles only uses one directly. The others go through people in Toronto and Singapore. The attorney shifted. Margaret kept talking. There's a man named Victor Lane who handles the offshore transfers. South Coast Consulting is not a consulting company. They use it to move losses out of gaming accounts before the money goes overseas. Agent Bennett began writing. What about the initials on the ledger? I know most of them. And the passwords? I have them. Annie watched Margaret finally stop bargaining. For the next 2 hours, she gave names, account numbers, email addresses, and access codes. Some information surprised even Agent Bennett. When the meeting ended, Annie stood. Margaret called her name. Annie stopped near the door. I am sorry, Margaret said again. Annie nodded. I know. Then she left. Outside the building, Agent Bennett caught up with her. You did well. Annie shook her head. I didn't do anything. You made a difficult choice. I just stopped making hers for her. Agent Bennett's phone buzzed. She checked the screen. What is it? Annie asked. The agent looked up. One of Margaret's passwords worked. And? It opened an account archive tied to Golden Harbor. Annie waited. Agent Bennett slipped the phone into her pocket. There are hundreds of transactions. How many countries? At least 4 so far. Annie looked back at the federal building. Charles had been arrested. Margaret had finally started telling the truth. But the network behind them was only now becoming visible. And for the first time, Annie understood that catching one man had never been the end of the story. By the next morning, the account archive Margaret had opened was no longer a collection of strange numbers on a screen. It had begun to form a map. Agent Bennett called Annie shortly after 7. We've confirmed transfers through companies in the United States, Canada, Singapore, and the Caribbean. Annie sat on the edge of the bed in the temporary residence. All from Golden Harbor? Golden Harbor is one piece. There are other companies feeding money into the same system. And Charles? His companies appear repeatedly. Annie rubbed her forehead. So he really was running it. We're building the case to show what role he played. The records are giving us much more than we had yesterday. What kind of records? Payment histories, loan balances, cryptocurrency transfers, property purchases. Some money went through companies that existed mostly on paper. Annie thought about Margaret moving money from one account to another while telling her there was nothing left for groceries, school, or anything else. How much? Agent Bennett paused. Millions. Annie looked at the wall. Margaret had tried to bargain away her future over a debt that now seemed tiny beside the numbers investigators were uncovering. Were there other people like her? Yes. How many? We're still counting. That answer stayed with Annie, not because she felt sorry for what Margaret had done. That part had not changed, but Annie could now see the machinery around her stepmother. People lost money. They borrowed more. The debt grew. Then the network found new ways to collect. Bank accounts, property, business interests, anything with value. Sometimes desperation did the rest. Annie asked, did Charles pick people who were already in trouble? That's one of the patterns we're examining. So he didn't have to force them into anything. He just waited until they had nowhere else to turn. Agent Bennett was quiet for a moment. That's a fair way to describe what some of these records suggest. Annie looked at the community college application still open on her laptop. Margaret always said one more win would fix everything. That belief keeps a lot of gambling systems profitable. Except this wasn't just gambling. No. By noon, several accounts tied to the investigation had been frozen while agents worked with other jurisdictions. Search warrants were executed at business offices connected to Whitmore. Records from 2 property companies were seized. More names entered the investigation. Charles's attorney released a statement saying his client had operated legitimate businesses and had never authorized illegal debt collection. Annie read the statement once, then closed the article. She had heard enough people explain Charles. She preferred the records. 2 days later, Agent Bennett told her she could return to Bennett Estate under updated security arrangements. When Annie stepped into the staff residence again, the first thing she saw was the mug she had left beside the sink. Mrs. Davis had washed it and placed it upside down on a towel. You're back. I said I was coming back. Mrs. Davis handed her an apron. Then the upstairs guest rooms still need towels. Annie smiled. No welcome party? You want balloons? No. Good. I don't have balloons. Within 20 minutes, Annie was pushing a housekeeping cart down the second-floor hallway. Fresh sheets, folded towels, Small bottles of shampoo. Nothing about the work had changed. That was exactly why she wanted to do it. For days. Every adult around her had been talking about investigators, lawyers, frozen accounts, international transfers and charges. Now Annie stood beside a linen closet counting bath towels. 6, 7, 8. Ordinary numbers. She liked those better. At lunch, Mrs. Davis made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup in the staff kitchen. The television above the refrigerator showed Richard Bennett walking toward the front entrance while reporters called questions from beyond the gate. Annie set down her spoon. What are they doing here? Mrs. Davis reached for the remote. News people discovered Eleanor's loan. On television, one reporter shouted, "Mr. Bennett, did you use your influence to have Margaret Carter arrested?" Another called, "Are you financially supporting Annie Carter?" Richard stopped. Mrs. Davis left the television on. Richard turned toward the reporters. "I called law enforcement after an employee told me she did not want to leave with people who came for her. Did you save her from Charles Whitmore?" Richard's answer came without hesitation. "No." The reporters pressed forward. Richard continued, "She saved herself." She said no. The rest of us finally listened. Annie stopped eating. Mrs. Davis glanced at her. "Well," Annie looked down at her soup. "He remembered." "Remembered what?" "That I didn't want him turned into the hero." Richard answered only 2 more questions before going inside. Later that afternoon, he asked Annie to come to his office. A lawyer from the Bennett family estate was there. Annie paused near the desk. "Am I supposed to sign something?" "Only if you decide to." The lawyer placed a document in front of her. Richard said, "Eleanor's loan gives her estate a financial claim against Margaret." Annie's expression tightened. "I can't pay that." "I didn't say you could." Richard tapped the document. "I'm waiving the estate's claim against any money investigators determine should be restored to you." Annie read the first page. "Why?" "Because Eleanor gave Margaret that money believing it would help you. Taking recovered money from you now would accomplish the opposite. But she was owed it." "Yes. And you're just giving that up?" "I'm not giving away your money. I'm declining to take it." Annie looked at the lawyer. "Is there some condition?" "No," the lawyer said. "No repayment agreement. No employment condition. No obligation to Mr. Bennett." Annie returned her attention to Richard. "You really don't want anything?" "No. People don't usually do that." Richard folded his hands on the desk. "Some debts should be collected. Some should be ended." Annie thought about Margaret, about Charles, about how many decisions in her life had been turned into numbers somebody else believed they could collect. She signed the acknowledgement, showing that the lawyer had explained the document to her. When she finished, Richard slid the papers toward his attorney. "That's all." Annie remained seated. "Mr. Bennett?" "Yes?" "What you said outside, about me saving myself. It was true. You helped. So did Mrs. Davis. So did the officers. So did the investigators." He paused, "But none of us could say no for you." That evening, federal authorities announced that the investigation into companies linked to Charles Whitmore had expanded beyond Georgia. More arrests were expected. More accounts were being examined. More people were beginning to talk. Annie listened to the report from the staff kitchen, then turned the television off herself. She had work in the morning, and, for the first time, a college admissions form waiting for her that night. The network was beginning to come apart. Annie's life was beginning to come together. The investigation continued for months. But Annie's days slowly stopped revolving around it. Charles Whitmore remained in federal custody while prosecutors worked through financial records recovered from his companies. Several people connected to Golden Harbor were charged in the United States, and investigators overseas began examining accounts linked to the same network. Charles continued to deny directing illegal gambling operations, but the records Margaret provided had given investigators something his lawyers could not dismiss as rumor. There were bank transfers, messages, account histories, names, dates. Money had a way of remembering where people had tried to hide it. Margaret eventually entered a guilty plea to several charges connected to fraud and misuse of funds. Her cooperation with investigators was considered, but it did not erase what she had done. Annie did not attend every hearing. At first she thought she should. Then one morning Mrs. Davis found her checking the court calendar before work. "You have class tonight?" "Yes." "And a shift this morning?" "Yes." Mrs. Davis pointed toward the phone. "Then why are you planning your whole day around Margaret?" Annie considered that. "I thought I should know what happens." "You should know what you need to know." "That's different?" "Very." Annie put the phone away. That afternoon, she changed the sheets in 2 guest rooms, helped inventory cleaning supplies, and spent her lunch break finishing an accounting assignment. The ordinary parts of life began taking up space again. She liked that. A month later, a letter arrived. The return address told her who had sent it before she opened the envelope. Margaret. Annie carried it around for half the day. She left it beside her lunch, put it in her locker, took it out again. Finally, after her shift, she sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Davis nearby and opened it. The letter was 4 pages. Margaret apologized. She wrote that she had spent years believing the next bet would repair the previous one. Every loss created another excuse to keep going. She told herself she was borrowing money instead of taking it. She told herself she could replace Annie's money before anyone knew. Then the losses became too large. Charles offered credit. The credit became debt. The debt became fear. Margaret wrote that none of that excused what she had done. Annie stopped there. Mrs. Davis asked, "You all right?" "I don't know." "That answer still works." Annie continued reading. Near the end, Margaret wrote that she missed her and hoped one day Annie might forgive her. Annie folded the pages. "Are you going to answer?" Mrs. Davis asked. "Not today." "Good enough." Annie placed the letter back in the envelope. She did not tear it up. She did not carry it around either. She put it in a drawer in her room and went to class. By spring, Annie had completed her first semester at community college. She chose accounting as her main course of study, with an interest in financial investigations. When Richard heard, he gave her a fountain pen in a plain wooden case. Annie opened it, then immediately looked at him. "This looks expensive." "It isn't. That sounds like something rich people say." Richard smiled. "Faire point." He touched the case. It was Eleanor's. Annie's expression changed. "I can't take that." "You can." "Why?" "She used it when she volunteered with scholarship programs." Annie ran one finger along the edge of the case. Richard added, "She used to say education was one of the few things nobody could repossess." Annie looked at him. "You sure?" "Yes." She took the pen. "Thank you." Richard nodded. No speech followed. That was one reason Annie had learned to trust him. He rarely made kindness about himself. A year after the morning everything changed, Annie was working in the same front section of Bennett Estate. A newer housekeeping employee was carrying a tray of glasses through the foyer when one slipped. It struck the floor and broke. The woman froze. "Oh no, I'm so sorry." Annie was already reaching for the cleaning cart. "It's fine. I can pay for it." Annie looked at her. "For one glass? I don't want Mr. Bennett thinking I'm careless." Annie handed her a dustpan. "He cares more about people than glasses." The woman gave her a doubtful look. "You sure?" "Pretty sure." Together they cleaned the pieces. When Annie stood, Richard was crossing the foyer with his briefcase. He glanced at the floor. "Everything all right?" Annie held up the dustpan. "National emergency avoided." Richard looked at the broken glass. "I'm relieved." The other employee laughed nervously. Richard continued toward the front entrance, then stopped. "Class tonight?" Annie nodded. "Accounting." "How is it?" "Hard." "Good." Annie raised an eyebrow. "Good? If it were easy, you'd be paying tuition to learn things you already know." She smiled. "That sounds like something you tell your executives. They complain more." Richard walked outside. Annie remained in the foyer for a moment. Her eyes moved toward the front doors. A year earlier, every sound near those doors had made her wonder whether Margaret had returned. Every car near the gate had meant something. Every raised voice had pulled at her. Now sunlight came through the glass. A delivery driver passed outside. Someone from landscaping pushed a cart along the walkway. The doors were simply doors again. Annie picked up her cleaning cloth and returned it to the cart. At 18, Annie Carter had believed freedom meant finding someone powerful enough to stand between her and the person controlling her life. She had learned something better. Richard had helped. Mrs. Davis had helped. The officers and investigators had helped. But none of them had given Annie her freedom. They had listened when she finally claimed it. No debt could decide her future. No family obligation could erase her voice. No wealthy man could purchase her choices. And fear, however loud it became, did not get the final word. Annie looked once more at the hallway where she had run toward Richard a year earlier. She could still remember the words that had escaped her before she had time to think. "Don't let her fin me." Back then, it had been a plea. Now Annie understood what had happened afterward. Someone had finally asked what she wanted, and Annie had answered, "No." This story reminds us that love, family, and gratitude should never be used as chains. No one has the right to control another person's future through fear, money, guilt, or obligation. Annie's journey shows that asking for help is not weakness, and that real kindness does not demand repayment. Justice may take time, but truth becomes powerful when someone finally has the courage to speak. Most of all, the story teaches that freedom begins when a person understands that their voice, their choices, and their life are worth protecting. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.